my man, Glenn Diesen. Glenn Diesen is a Norwegian political scientist. He is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. Glenn, thank you for joining me, man. How you doing today?
Oh, very good. Yeah, it's good to see you again.
Oh, thank you. What is Trump doing and why? Meaning, at this point, he is apparently pulled military aid. He is putting the screws to Zelensky. He told him during the meeting, I have empowered you to be a tough guy, which when he said that, my first thought was, okay, Trump is going to cut aid. If he's empowering him to be a tough guy, he needs him to not be a tough guy in order to try to get a deal. He gave his speech yesterday to both halls of Congress. Give me your take on what he's doing and why.
Well, from what we watched in the Oval Office, I think it was very clear that he wanted, he said many times he wants the war to come to an end. So when Zelensky came, they were talking him, they wanted to talk him into accepting negotiations to start bringing this war to an end. And obviously Zelensky, he kept pushing back against this by instead, invoking all this language that the Russians are evil and again, signaling that there's no possibility to have peace. Indeed, that's when the clash began, when Vance suggested, listen, we have to do diplomacy. And Zelensky started talking a bit down to him, suggesting, what kind of diplomacy do you think you can do with Russians? And, He was very hostile. And I've been also told that Trump had asked him to wear a suit before he comes, just to signal that, because he wears his war costume during conflict, so it would be a nice symbol that he puts on his suit and he's prepared to that this is him signaling that now it's time to bring this to an end. But he didn't. He was pushing back against this. Even later on, Zelensky was making the arguments that this war will last for a long time. So and Trump keeps pushing back, saying like this, I hope this is wrong, because we won't accept it. And I think this was the argument of Trump. The only reason why Zelensky can continue to resist negotiations because the Americans are giving him the weapons that he needs to fight. So why would the U.S. do this? If he's going to defy the Americans in pushing him to negotiate, then why should the U.S. enable him to defy the Americans? So this is kind of the logic behind it. Trump decided to cut the military aid to Ukraine, and this will force Zelensky to return because the Europeans, they don't have much at all. This is America's NATO. The Europeans can't fill America's shoes. So this is, as Trump suggested in the Oval Office, we are holding all the cards here. You can't come here and put pressure on us. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Why do you think Zelensky did that? Like, do you think? Because from my point of view, it's like, okay, clearly you're not going to go after the president in the Oval Office. But apparently he thought he could. And I guess my take is, and I know you can't get into Zelensky's mind, fair enough. But do you think there was a strategy at work, or Zelensky just couldn't control himself? I mean, Lindsey Graham said that he talked to Zelensky that morning and effectively told him, go in, shut up, take the deal. And Zelensky didn't do that. He did a complete 180.
No, he did not. And I think maybe he wanted to manipulate the way in. That is, if you, again, look at the language he said when he was arguing that, he brought this picture saying that, the Russians are all war criminals, they broke every deal, you can't trust them. Some of those stories told were lies, by the way, because the Russians did accept the prisoner exchange. So, But anyways, if you can make the opponent buy into this narrative that the other side is all evil and bad, then you have to also buy into the narrative that it's very difficult to make peace with such a bad actor. But this is also why the Americans were pushing back against this. For example, the US actually voted with the Russians at the United Nations because the Americans said, we don't want to put all the blame on Russia because this is not conducive if you want to bring the two parties together to make a compromise. You can't have one villain and one victim and then expect a compromise. So this is what the Americans were pushing for. And I think this is why Zelensky tried to manipulate by pushing this very aggressive rhetoric, which is why Trump said, this guy, he's got so much hate for the Russians. I mean, this is, he wanted to push back against this, that this was something about Zelensky as opposed to the actual situation. Now, why Zelensky would take this huge risk and behave in this manner in front of the American president, especially Trump, it's hard to say. On the other hand, for the past 3 years, no matter where he goes, he's treated as royalty. He's the new Churchill. He's celebrated, indeed. When he goes to Europe, you see there's nothing he can say that's wrong. And indeed, this was kind of the deal he was sold 3 years ago as well. Keep in mind that at the Istanbul Agreement, the Russians and Ukrainians were very close to a deal. And it was the Americans and the British who convinced him not to take the deal. And from what I understand is more or less the deal was, if you throw this peace agreement away and choose war, then NATO will give you all the weapons you need to defeat the Russians. And of course, we'll do what we always do with the good guys, which is to build them up in the media, give you a nice propaganda campaign, make you the next Churchill. So he was kind of used to going around getting whatever he wanted. So I guess he didn't expect this fierce pushback from Trump and Vance. But again, this is them putting pressure on Zelensky. They're telling him now it's time to end the war. So they're putting all the pressure.
You know what's wild about it? One of the most interesting things in the whiplash that I think myself and people who are analyzing this felt is the change in language. For like the last 3 years, Joe Biden ran with this just grotesque propaganda, unprovoked war in Ukraine. Russia's trying to take over all of Europe. And Europe ran along with this also. It's saying the exact same thing. Oh, we're with you for as long as it takes. And Trump gets in and immediately is like, well, this was not unprovoked. And not just not unprovoked, this was never going to be accepted. Ukraine was never going to be accepted in it. Like, it is a sharp demarcation point in the language. And I guess part of it is because you need the language to change. You're going to make some kind of agreement or deal. Europe hasn't gotten the memo, though. And they're still in this same rhetoric of unprovoked war of aggression. Putin wants to take off all of Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're going with this idea of trying to get Trump to do a backstop. And up to this point, Trump has effectively said no. Now, the mineral deal, Zelensky has come out and said, okay, we'll sign the deal. We'll sign the deal. just please, God, we'll sign the deal. Why is the mineral deal important in the context of ending the war?
Well, first, let me just say very quickly that this the reason why Trump said that the war is now provoked, NATO provoked it by threatening to expand into Ukraine, is because once you say that the war is provoked, it's a bit like the rhetoric that Zelensky had in the Oval Office. That is, it's one is good, one is bad. Now, right. once he said the war is unprovoked, this means any compromise is now appeasement. You're emboldening the adversary to take even more territory, to be more aggressive. You're rewarding unprovoked expansionist behavior. Now, if you're recognizing that it was provoked, now you opened the space for making a compromise. Okay, we won't push NATO, you do this, and now we can have a peace. So moving away from the unprovoked narrative is imperative if you want to actually reach a peace. Oh, sorry, I forgot your question.
The mineral deal. So
mineral deal, sorry.
Yeah, because Zelensky has come out and, the entire point of him going there was to sign the deal. And Europe kept saying, sign the deal. Lindsey Graham, sign the deal. Everybody's telling him, sign the deal. And in Zelensky's mind, he's like, well, I want security guarantees. And it doesn't seem like he quite get that the mineral deal is indirect security guarantees, right? I mean, but give me your take on this.
Well, it is intended to be a security guarantee. This is how it's sold, at least. Now, the main idea is, the Americans are not going to go to war against Russia, but by having very long-term economic interest for United States in Ukraine, this would make the Russians effectively think twice before they would invade Russia. And it's not as if the Americans can just put their hand in the ground, take it up, and leave. This is the mining processes, the processing of it. This is going to be a process which will take a very long time. We might be talking decades here. So this is something that creates economic incentives for the United States to have a stable Ukraine that's not in war. So this was considered to be the security guarantee. Now you can ask, yes, will the Americans get a lot of economic benefits? Yeah, I think obviously. Is this a good security guarantee? No, not really. But it is the best one there is, because people keep throwing out the idea of security guarantees. It's wonderful. Now we can deter the Russians. But keep in mind that Russia considers this, the reason it invaded was they consider this to be an existential threat. That is, they knew that this could end up in a war with NATO. They knew this could escalate into a nuclear war. But the way they see it, if they didn't roll back NATO now, the country might cease to exist, because this was seen as a bridgehead for the NATO countries into Russia. So this is it's not a great security guarantee, but again, it is the best one, because the worst thing you want to do in any peace agreement is to give any of the sides an incentive to restart hostilities. Yes, you're deterring the Russians; they don't want to invade anymore, but you're giving the Ukrainians all the incentives in the world to restart the conflict. Again, Zelensky has been very clear: I want all the territory back, including Crimea. Well, you're not going to be able to do that with your own army. However, if he has security guarantees from the United States, if war would restart now, suddenly you would have a very powerful U.S. army on your side, which would could be used towards retaking your territories. So it will almost be foolish not to restart the conflict if the Americans give security guarantees. So It's not as simple as we support you, and the rhetoric which is used, especially in Europe, is becoming so cartoonish that there's no scrutiny anymore.
Yeah, it's childish. I am shocked by it, to be frankly honest with you. It is so detached from reality. Like, the notion that this was unprovoked is nonsense. The idea that Putin was going to take 150,000 troops and take all of Europe is nonsense. It's like there's a level of dishonesty that is built into the entire narrative in Europe associated with this. Why? I don't quite get this. I mean, for one, it's against European interests to not use Russian oil. They've been buying Russian gas hand over fist, even if it's through third-party buyers. They've been damaging their own economies. What is the gain for Europe out of this? I get the gain for America out of this. I mean, we destroyed the pipeline, so we get to sell our oil, our gas, in a way, our LNG to Europe for more expensive. Europe buys our weapons in order to give to Ukraine. Like, meaning, I get what America gets out of this. What does Europe get out of this? This seems to just be a loss for Europe all the way through.
Well, I think there's some geostrategic ideas, there's some ideology, and there's a heavy dose of Russophobia. Now, the main idea after the Cold War was we're going to establish an international order based on collective hegemony. You would have the US and EU stand side by side, and this would be the collective hegemon, which would will dominate the world in perpetuity. Now, but to do this, of course, you have to create a Europe without the Russians. So expanding NATO, marginalizing Russia in Europe, it's a means to an end, and it's all very much the elites actually believe in this ideology of liberal peace. That is, as long as the West dominates, human rights, democracy will be able to be elevated, and we can transcend the great power rivalry of the past. So they do believe in this. So it becomes a promise of perpetual peace if we just commit ourselves to perpetual war first. And it's a bit foolish. But again, we also have a very heavy dose of Russophobia. I think the Russians have always been, at least for a few centuries now, been created as our mirror image. They are considered our other, the evil to our goodness, the barbarian to our civilization. This is the role that they have to play, and it's indeed Western unity depends a large extent on this hostility towards Russia, because this is what brought a lot of unity throughout the Cold War and also afterwards. And we see now that if the United States this is able to end the war in Ukraine, it's not just going to pull out of Ukraine, it wants to pull out of Europe as well, because we're moving into a multipolar order. The Americans want to focus on the Western Hemisphere, on Asia. So Europe goes from this, one of the two partners of a collective hegemony to now becoming completely irrelevant in the world. So there's a lot at stake, and continuing the war, I think, is something that keeps the Americans there, makes Europe relevant, and it has the promise of perhaps we can defeat the Russians and go back to some version of the 1990s where we were great. So it's I think it's, but some of them are just trapped in narratives. Some honestly believe now that this was unprovoked. Putin is Hitler. They want to restore the Soviet Union, because we've been telling each other this over and over again, and we crushed all dissent. There's no acceptance for, anyone who would say anything otherwise is then immediately accused of legitimizing the invasion, taking the side of the Russians, and so they are carrying water for Putin. This is not just academics and journalists. You see state leaders. When you have, for example, Viktor Orban of Hungary, if he says, listen, maybe diplomacy is a good thing, and he wants to talk to Zelensky and Putin, he's immediately castigated as an agent of Putin and pro-Russian. And now we don't have to listen to him anymore because he's illegitimate. So this is the mindset. There's no dissent anymore.
Wow, that's unfortunate. Putin is going to want a neutral Ukraine, a cobbled military. I mean, minimize at most. He is going to want the regions that Russia has already taken. Those are part of the Russian Federation at this point. He's not giving those up. Denazification of Ukraine, which most likely means a change in government of Ukraine, protection for the Russian language. From his point of view, these are his asks. He's already fundamentally won the war. Ukraine cannot change the context on the ground. Will Trump give him those things in the war? Meaning, what is he going to have to give of those things, if any, to end the war? Or is Trump going to just accept it?
Well, I think Trump, as Hegseth said, they already kind of agreed to the main premise here, or the main demands, which was Hegseth said no NATO expansion. Ukraine can't accept getting its territories back, not all of them at least. And there will be no security guarantees from the United States because that would translate into de facto NATO commitment within Ukraine, which is why the Russians invaded to begin with. So these are the main three things which it makes peace possible. Now, there's, of course, some room for negotiations on other issues. For example, the territories. What territories exactly? Again, Russia claims for the 4 oblasts, which is the next. However, they're not controlling all the territories in all of these 4 oblasts yet. So I'm not sure if the Americans are able to negotiate a change of administrative borders. So far, the Russians are rejecting it. But again, your beginning position is not necessarily where you have to end. They might be, they might be able to be convinced, but not on the key issues of, NATO expansion and security guarantees. But if you change the administrative border so Russia doesn't get territory it's not holding yet, perhaps something could be reached there. And also denazification. What does this actually mean? Again, it's a bit of a vague term. If there's merely a regime change, that means Zelensky goes and you have elections, and you maybe stop renaming streets after fascists, raising monuments of Hitler collaborators. This would be if it was something like this, let's allow the Russian Orthodox Church again, give people religious freedoms, allow the political opposition to operate, allow restore the Russian language as a secondary language. If you do something like this, it could be it can be considered denazification. So some of these things are vague enough, which gives some scope for negotiations.
I'm curious on this idea of the security architecture of Europe. Before this started, I always say Putin was standing out like a preacher, begging people to come to Jesus. I don't know if you've ever been to a black church, but the preacher sweating, he's holding the Bible, begging people to come up to the church. I felt that way about Putin when he was saying, look, we need to come to some kind of agreement. This situation doesn't work. You guys are blowing off Minsk. I am very serious about this. And over again, he put out his own plan for a new security architecture of Europe that didn't include the expansion of NATO. Europe told him Russia doesn't get security guarantees. The US blew him off. All of Europe was like, how dare you beseech us for anything? He went in. Well, now that Russia has shown hard power and that they can change the context on the ground in a way that Europe can't do anything about, Trump seems to be willing, in whatever conversation they have, it seems that the conversation is ultimately going to be a new security architecture of Europe, that whatever they agree upon in the context of Ukraine is almost de facto going to be this kind of new norm of international relations between the US, Europe, and Russia. Is that true? Do you think that's true? And if it is true, what do you think that ultimately looks like?
Well, it's hard to say what it's going to look like, but I think this unavoidably will impact the European security architecture. And that's a good thing, because the war in Ukraine, it didn't happen in a vacuum. From my perspective, this is a symptom of a collapsing European security architecture. And as you correctly said, the Russians have for a long time wanted to have a post-Cold War settlement after the Cold War, which was mutually acceptable. Keep in mind that initially we had agreements to have an inclusive European security architecture. It was called the OSCE, but this was effectively thrown aside when we decided to instead expand NATO to create a more hegemonic Europe. But the Russians, they initially didn't give up when they realized that we're going to expand NATO instead of having the OSCE as the main institution. They even, Yeltsin and then Putin, they all suggested, they could join NATO. They was met with a cold shoulder. 2007, of course, Putin gave this speech where he warned you can't have this, unipolar or hegemonic world order. It's going to result in catastrophe. In 2008, they proposed a new pan-European security institution. 2010, they proposed a EU-Russian union. So they tried over and over again, and nothing worked. And the main reason why they saw conflict coming is because the whole premise of NATO's hegemonic peace is will be so dominant that it doesn't matter what the Russians think. We can just roll up all the way to the border, put any missiles we want there, and if the Russians complain, as we would have done, we can just say, well, Europe is NATO and you're not in NATO, so you don't have a voice here. And this is it's an extreme radical way of looking at security. So no matter what happens in Ukraine now, I think this system is broken, which means, well, what is the goal of NATO now? Because the main purpose was to create the military framework for a hegemonic peace in Europe, one which demanded that the largest country in Europe by population, territory, resources, and military power did not have a seat at the table. Everyone else has a seat at the table, except the largest one. I mean, it goes without saying that this is a ridiculous proposition to begin with. It would be like creating a North American military alliance and then keeping the Americans out and just surrounding them with Chinese or Russian military bases. It's absurd. This was not a good recipe for stability at all. So I think now that the Americans are recognizing, we have to walk away from this, it opens up possibility for other things. But of course, the animosity now is so great. The distrust is so great. So it's going to be very hard to do something between the Europeans and the Russians, at least. I think the Russians and Americans can, surprisingly enough, patch things up rather quickly. But the Europeans, I think it's going to be very, very hard.
Yeah, but if it's hard, I guess my thing is, what does it look like? And maybe what does it look like is kind of hard. So fair enough. But at the very least, it seems that Ukraine is going to be neutral, or at the very least, it has to be, right? I mean, I don't, and it's going to still be that intermediary between, let's say, Europe and Russia, and the way that Russia wanted that buffer zone anyway. Or am I wrong on this? I mean, that's the way I view it. I would imagine it has to be neutral. Otherwise, Russia's not going to accept it. They're just going to keep moving militarily.
No, exactly. No, so Ukraine has to be neutral. This has to be the foundation. I've been saying this for 3 years. It has to be the foundation of any peace agreement. Neutrality have to be restored, and that's the direction they're moving. But this is also why when the Europeans are suggesting, hey, we need after in a peace deal, we need to have NATO troops or European troops on the ground with, as the British say, fighter planes in the air, and all of this to make sure Russia behaves. It's absurd, because this goes against the whole principle of neutrality. Also, it ignores the fact that the losing side in a war usually doesn't get to dictate the outcome.
Exactly.
But again, I'm looking at this with optimism, because I never expected the Americans to accept these terms from the Russians. So, and the Russians will not accept anything else but neutrality. So I thought this would be resolved on the battlefield, because without an agreement to restore Ukraine's neutrality, what would you do if you're Russia? You wouldn't accept that Odessa, for example, in the future will become this is a historical Russian region and city, and you wouldn't accept it to become a NATO territory. So I would expect that the Russian would simply take all the historical territories of Russia, that is everything from Kharkov to Odessa, and they would wreck the rest to make sure that it can't be used as a front line against the Russians. So I predicted devastation for Ukraine and becoming a landlocked destroyed Rump state. So the fact now that the United States is willing to accept neutrality, it opens up for a much bigger space. If Ukraine is neutral, then the Russians, for example, don't have to take Odessa anymore. They don't have to wreck the rest of the country. So suddenly there's more reason for optimism. But of course, the Europeans do not see it this way. I mean, the media here is just it's gone completely off the rails. It's really absurd to read. It's a bit of a, I think hopefully future academics in the future will look into what went on here, because it is completely mad. The discourse, the rhetoric, the discussions they're having. So
no, I agree with you. I look, I was on the radio station because on the radio station you pay attention to world news, and I was watching it and I was like, this is so different than reality. Like reality just didn't matter. It didn't the notion that we overthrew the government and we called it a revolution of dignity as opposed to a coup. Like the language was so over the top, and it was over the top in a way where it was honestly easy to verify that they were lying.
But the reason why they got away with this is because we have fact checkers in the European Union, and if you call it a coup, then the fact checkers will say it wasn't a coup, it was a revolution, a democratic revolution of dignity. But this isn't fact checking, this is narrative checking. This is if facts would mean you can look, did they have support by Ukrainians? Majority? No. Did it topple a democratic elected government? Yes. Was it a violation of the constitution? Yes. I mean, this will be facts, but they don't check. They don't check facts. They check narratives. And again, anything can be. It's like saying, "No, Russia didn't invade. It had a humanitarian intervention." I mean, this is nonsense. It's just manipulation of language, and just to show how crazy things have become now in Europe. Once they had this spat in the Oval Office, the Europeans met in Paris. They were gonna come up with an alternative peace agreement. And I was very curious, because the Europeans don't want peace now. They want to continue the war. So what exactly would be the alternative? And then you had Macron coming out with this proposal saying, well, let's have a partial ceasefire. That means only, stop having missiles fired from air, from sea, and destruction of energy infrastructure. The three areas where Russia completely dominates, by the way.
Right.
This should be ceasefire. You can still fight on the ground, but Russia, you shouldn't have any more air support because you dominate in this aspect. And we should do this for 1 month. And after 1 month, then we can start to discuss negotiations. So, what is the purpose? Well, it's Putin can show that he's acting in good faith. I mean, it's just madness. It doesn't make any sense at all. And no one wants to discuss what does it mean for the future of Ukraine. Will we restore neutrality? It's just everything is another Minsk agreement. Everything is just let's just send more weapons to Ukraine and prolong this. If we do have to agree to ceasefire, we still want to have it on the table that we can reconquer the territories later. We'll have some time to rebuild our military force. We can rearm Ukraine. I mean, they openly speak about this, and they call it
which
peace.
is unacceptable. Yeah. I mean, that's unacceptable. Does Europe realize how irrelevant it's become? I mean, the idea that Macron would come out and say something like that is absurd. Keir Starmer, the 20 British troops that they have in their military, the notion that they're going to send them into Ukraine is absurd. When Trump turned to Keir Starmer and says, hey, you can take the Russians, right? And everybody in the room laughed, basically using British weakness as a punchline to a joke. And, this is the British Empire. The sun never sets on the British Empire. After the Second World War or the First World War, I think Britain owned 51% of the globe. And now their military prowess is being used as a joke. I guess my thing is, but this is all of Europe. And yet they're the ones who are the most warmongers, even to the context of the US at this point. How are they this? Okay. I don't want to ask that question. I'm sorry. I'm being brutal. What is Putin thinking in this moment? I want to go back to Europe, but what is Putin thinking at this moment, do you think? I mean, how is he viewing these events in the world going forward?
No, well, I think well they have two options because the Ukrainian army is about to collapse. Well, it is collapsing. It's weakening by the day very fast as well, and Russia's strengthening. So they know that the war has been won, irrespective of what the United States would do. But so they have two options. One, you can let the Ukraine collapse, and Russia can just impose any peace it wants. It can take the territories it wants. It can put in any government it wants. But again, this will be a very messy affair. It will
Yeah.
be, as you would say, a very ugly peace. Alternatively, they can find a peace deal, something they didn't believe was possible until now with Trump, and then of course they have to lower their demands and expectations. On the other hand, if you can get a political settlement, I mean, we haven't had this. We never, after the Cold War, we never had a mutually acceptable settlement. This is why we have war today. If they can make a deal with the Americans, and ideally America can push Ukraine and the Europeans on this as well, they can actually achieve this, and there would be something at least. We can draw a line under this, like just say we're done now with this fighting over Ukraine. So, it will be neutral. We're going to have some security agreements. We're going to look at this European security architecture because we can't continue like this. If they can get us a deal like this, I think that I'm very convinced actually that this is what Putin would go for. But again, he's not calling me, so I don't.
Right. No, that's fair. But there's an argument to be made. I've spoken to some analysts who made the point of saying Russia doesn't want to be pushed into a peace deal, that their lot is better off by taking the areas that they want to take and then drawing the line and say, okay, we're done. Basically, we got the Donbass region. This is in our pockets. We got the Russian-speaking region. We got Odessa. Now we can call it a day. And that being pushed into an agreement before they accomplish those things is not necessarily what they want. What do you think about that argument?
Well, it depends how long this goes on. And this is kind of in Trump's argument as well. Like, we need a deal quick, otherwise there won't be a deal. Now, why is this? Because Russia is winning on the battlefield, very much so. And it's and I know that the Western media only wants to look at the shifts in territory. But the main way you would measure this would be in a war of attrition, when you look at the attrition rates. And the Ukrainians are just losing men very, very fast in huge amounts. So the ability to protect territory now weakens. And this is why also now, by the way, seeing territory shift much faster. Russia doesn't have to bomb cities to the ground to take them. Some of these towns, when I look at the photos afterwards, they're completely intact. So so the things are falling apart faster and faster. So you need a peace now. I mean, the longer we wait, the less negotiation power there will be with the Russians. And but again, it's it really remains to be seen how this will play out. But this is what frustrates me again with the European position, because they act as if this is a principled position that either you can defeat Russia or you make a deal. This is not what's going to happen. Either you make a deal now, or Ukraine collapses and you're in an even worse deal. And I think this is what the Trump is now pushing pressure on the Europeans as well, because if the Europeans will try to sabotage the peace plan he has going forward, then I think it's just going to said, you know what, I tried, I wanted to make peace, now it's your problem, and then just walk away from it. And as you said, with Britain and France being the main military powers, this thing would fall apart fairly quickly. And I think this is the direction we're going. And you can see the pressure already mounting on the Europeans, by the way. Vance is also mocking the Europeans now. I saw an interview with him 2 days ago saying, what security guarantee do you want? Do you want us on the ground there with the minerals, or do you want some European country with 20,000 troops who hasn't fought a war in 40 years? I mean, they're mocking the Europeans now. And this is partly because the Europeans are, when they say, oh, we can fill America's shoes, it's delusional, but it's also an indication of the intent to push against and sabotage what Trump is trying to do here.
No, I totally agree with you. I want to get your take on this. This is a lunatic, as I define her. But give me your take on the efficacy of this and whether or not this is even possible. It seems that Europe has gotten the picture that America wants to leave. that we want to call it a day. And they've apparently come to this thing of, okay, well, we need to deal with our own security. If I'm not mistaken, it wasn't Schultz. It was another gentleman who made, I think it was Tusk, who effectively made the speech of like, look, we have 500 billion people asking a country of 300 million to defend us. We have our own defensive potential. Why don't we develop it? This is Ursula von der Leyen. Listen to what she says here, and I want to get your take on it.
So if member states would increase their defense spending by 1.5% of GDP on average, this could create fiscal space of close to 650 billion euros over a period of 4 years. The second proposal will be a new instrument. It will provide 150 billion euros of loans to member states for defense investment. This is about basically spending better and spending together. And we're talking about pan-European capabilities, domains, like, for example, air and missile defense, the artillery systems, missiles and ammunition, drones and anti-drone systems, but also to address other needs from cyber to military mobility, for example. This will help member states to pool demand and to buy together. And of course, with this equipment, member states can massively step up their support to Ukraine.
This is so stupid. Like, the notion that she is saying, because the first part of it, okay, I get, right? We want to have, Europe needs to be able to defend itself. We can't entirely rely on the United States, okay? No issue. And so we're going to create a pool for $650 billion or euros, okay? And then she says, and we can use that to give it to Ukraine. For one, how fast does she think she's going to get this up and running where she's going to get 650 billion euros? And two, how long does she think this is going to go on? So she's talking about what, in 10 years to be still giving weapons to Ukraine? That's outrageous. Like, does she hear herself right now? Give me your take on this. For one, what are the chances of Europe doing this, where they're going to raise this much money? And two, how long do they expect to have this kind of obligation to Ukraine where they're still giving it weapons 10 years later? And I'm estimating 10 years because it's going to take a while for them to get this up and running. Give me your take on this.
Well, first of all, this is a reason why the Russians would like a deal if the Americans could get the Europeans on this. Because if the Europeans going to continue to send weapons and missiles into Ukraine for another 10 years, it would just it would be so many problems. But well, first of all, we can start with the money. I don't think it's there because the Europeans have spent a lot of money over the past few years, especially on issues like COVID and the Green New Deal, and a lot of money and debt was taken on, which could have worked when the interest rates were low. They're not low anymore, and it's much more expensive now to manage and service this debt. Furthermore, the European economies are not just having more debt, but they're also not that productive anymore. Keep in mind that under Biden, the United States destroyed the energy infrastructure for Europe with the Nord Stream. We have had heavy deindustrialization now in Germany, which is very problematic, given that this was considered the economic engine of Europe. We see that the failing German industries have then been lured over to United States and some China with offers of subsidies if they do jump across the Atlantic. So the things are not great in Europe. So from this perspective, now jumping into it and doing this huge rearmament, hundreds of billions of euros in weapons, I don't see the money. I don't see the ability to move forward on this. It sounds like fantasy to me. And as you pointed out as well, this is going to take a long time. You need to develop the skill sets, the factories. There's a huge infrastructure that has to be put behind. This is going to take many, many years. So, and Ukraine doesn't have many years. It had a few months. Now that America's cutting the military funding, it will probably have much less. So things are not going well. So this does make sense. I can see some opportunism here, though. That is, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think, a key focus here is used to build the EU as well. That is to centralize power even more. There's much talk about war bonds and all these things. So I do. There could be some rationality behind there, but as you pointed out, what serious analyst out there believes that this is something that can have any impact on the war at all?
Yeah.
Again, this war is going to finish. It's over. America said they will pull the plug on it, and again, I'm not sure what the Europeans wanted to achieve anyways. Let's say all of this could magically appear tomorrow. What was the plan anyways of defeating the world's largest nuclear power in a war it considers to be an existential threat? What do you think Russia would do? Would they simply capitulate and go home while the Europeans begin to put their missiles on the borders of Russia? No, of course not. And no, it's but this is what happens when you don't have honest debates about why the war started to begin with.
Do they actually believe the stuff that they say? It's so outrageous. Putin is going to take over all of Europe. Really? He couldn't even, when he first went in, he only had like 150,000 troops. They weren't even enough to take over all of Ukraine. Even though they could take territory, they couldn't hold it. How the hell are they going to take over all of Europe? But they would say it, and they would say it, unashamed, no shame at all. Like, do they really believe this stuff? And how are the populations in Europe accepting this? And this could be the last question. How are the populations in Europe themselves listening to what sounds like lunatics to me? They seem delusional. That seems delusional. But she's saying it with a straight face. And she's saying it to an auditorium of people who are sitting there clapping as she says it. This is the same group that couldn't put up 2% for NATO. The same group that was asking its populations to effectively take misery for the benefit of Ukraine. What is the populations of Europe thinking at this moment about this? I was there covering the previous European parliamentary elections. They seem to disagree with these people, and yet von der Leyen is back in power. What are the European populations thinking about the things that these people are saying and positions they're taking?
Well, it's hard to say, but first, let me just point out, the fact that the Russians moved in to conquer Ukraine. This is obviously false. As you said, the troop levels they went out in with, you couldn't conquer a huge country like Ukraine with these few troops. But it wasn't designed to do this. It was designed to force Ukraine to the negotiation table to implement the Minsk agreement, which it had failed to implement for 7 years with the help of the West to sabotage it. So I think this was very clear, and you saw this also with when the Russians invaded. They also didn't bomb that much. They avoided too much destruction because they knew that this would make it more difficult for Kiev to negotiate. Just as a comparison, on the first month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it dropped fewer bombs than America did on Iraq on the first 24 hours. So
that's right.
So you can't really compare this. And lastly, if you go on the Ukrainian government's websites, you see that on the first day after the Russian invaded, Zelensky confirmed that, yes, the Russians contacted us. They want to discuss neutrality. We're ready to do this. So, and then on the third day after the invasion, they agreed to start negotiations based on neutrality. So all the evidence is already here. Now, what do the Europeans think? It's hard to say because none of the facts are available. They're not permitted pretty much because there's such a commitment to the narrative. If you just hint that perhaps Russia wasn't attempting to invade all of Ukraine, perhaps they were provoked, then it's immediately not treated. It's treated as an effort to legitimize it. The first thing we'll see, are you saying that Russia was right to invade, that they had the right to do so? It's like, no, I'm saying that they were provoked. And so it's impossible to get anything through. And there's a full conformity now in the media, again, among academics as well as the politicians. We have many news channels, we have debates, but all the newspapers say the same thing. and the debates are no one disagreeing against how virtuous this war is and how evil the Russians are. So it's it becomes a huge echo chamber. So it's it's no wonder, I think, that people have bought into this war narrative which they're being sold.
Glenn, man, I always appreciate your analysis. I always appreciate your take. Glenn Diesen, he's a Norwegian political scientist, a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. Glenn, where can people find you, by the way?
I have I'm on Substack. I write a lot there, also put videos there. Otherwise, I also have my own YouTube channel where we interview different people. Only yesterday, we interviewed the former CIA director of Russia analysis on exactly how the EU got trapped in narratives.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm also on X. But my favorite channel would be Substack.
Wait, how did they get trapped in the narratives? Since you mentioned it,
Well,
how did they get stuck into this echo chamber of sorts?
Well, so some of these narratives, for example, the unprovoked, that everyone had to repeat this mantra for 3 years that it was unprovoked now, and that Putin is the new Hitler, all of these things. Once everyone buys into this narrative and have to repeat it, now it's very difficult. How can you possibly, how do you make peace with Hitler? You don't make peace with Hitler. You have to defeat him on the battleground. If you think about negotiating and talking with him, that's called appeasement. So this is why all the Europeans continue to keep referring to Hitler and we're in the 1930s. This is Kaja Kallas. She was also saying this only a few days ago. This is talking to the Russians. This is called appeasement. We know from history that doesn't work. Look at Hitler. I mean, everyone has to repeat this over and over again. And once you put yourself into that corner, how can you possibly move out and say, oh well, actually it wasn't Hitler after all. They just thought that a hostile military bloc on their borders were not a good idea. And suddenly we have to start explain what we've been doing for the past 3 years, because all our politicians, they boycotted diplomacy after, again, sabotaging the Istanbul peace agreement in 2022. They all put a boycott. 3 years, no diplomacy, no negotiations. Imagine the possibilities they could have, not just resolve the conflicts, but perhaps at least they could reduce some of the horror of the escalations and the military activities. Instead, they just sat on the sideline, watching hundreds of thousands of young men die on the front line, and patting each other on the shoulder how virtuous they were because they're not talking to Hitler. Once you accept that this is not Hitler anymore, everything we've done for the past 3 years has to be seen through a very different lens. And suddenly, instead of being this virtuous, good people standing up for liberal democracy and standing up for Ukraine, it appears that we sacrificed Ukrainians in a quite cynical proxy war, and again we stripped them of all their democracy, their freedoms as well in the same process. So it's a very difficult way to move away from the little narratives we built for ourselves, to build ourselves up.
Oh, so true. And now we're trying to take 50% of the mineral wealth along with it.
I feel terrible, and I know that this is probably the best security guarantees, but I still don't care for it. They need these resources and the revenue themselves, because the country's been destroyed, and and they would never have accepted this unless they were in such a weak position. So it's they're terrible. This is what happens in proxy wars. Terrible. The Russians are taking their territory. The Americans want to take their resources, and the Europeans want to make sure that they continue fighting while there's still breathing Ukrainians left. So it's everyone wants something from them, and it's a horrible situation which they have been put in, including by Zelensky, by the way, who I do not think is this wonderful Churchill, which we're all obligated to celebrate here.
No, he's a dirtbag. My mom asked me the other day, why don't you like him? I was like, he got like 1 million people killed. Like he had a philosophical, ethical, legal responsibility to look after his country. That is decisively not what he's doing. And when the majority of Ukrainians are saying, we want peace, and this troll is running around screaming about more war, more weapons. He is an impediment. Glenn, man, thank you for this. You have a fantastic day. Be safe.
You too, tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Glenn Diesen, that man is fantastic.